wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. Really excited for today's guest, Dr. Kiran Krishnan, who is a real microbiome expert and entrepreneur in the space, has a lot of great insights on this topic, which we know is so important to understand now as it relates to health and longevity. Um, One of my partners, Deepthi, is also joining me today.
Hi guys.
You guys have met her before. So really looking forward to the conversation the three of us are going to have. Um, I'll just say a few words about Kiran, and then I'll turn it over to Deepthi, who can kind of frame us up to get started. But Kiran is one of the most seasoned experts in this field, and I say that because he brings not just a really solid research background in the space, having completed a PhD in microbiome science, but he has actually created some of the most category defining companies in the space, including a company called Microbiome Labs, which has created some of the most well known and well respected products in the microbiome space that are used by thousands of physicians around the world to treat microbiome related issues. He is now really broadened his exposure in the space. He has a number of companies that he works on, including Civ, which is a microbiome-based skin product, as well as Microbiome Education Center, which is a company focused on broadening the awareness of the microbiome as it relates to human health. So, with all that, let me turn it over to Deepthi, and she can kind of frame us up to get started.
Yeah. So that was a great intro, Kiran, I think that Anant did. But I would say you are one of my favorite scientist entrepreneurs because you've really done a great job at bridging the gap here. But can you tell people, so you started out as a microbiologist, right? And so what was it that interested you in the microbiome, which, not a lot of people talked about when you started your career out?
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. So actually, it was I would say the thing that really drove me towards focusing my professional work into the world of the microbiome was a interview that I did for an article for U.S. News and World Report. My research work was in at university was largely around pathogens. And of course, a lot of microbiologists study pathogens. That's a big area of interest because they can cause illness, right? But I'd done a interview, and somebody set me up with a reporter that was looking for microbiologists that could do an interview because what they really wanted to understand was this issue of the hygiene hypothesis, and is there a detriment to being clean and killing microbes too much? And one of the questions that I wanted to be able to answer for them was what percentage of microbes that have been discovered are actually harmful to human health? Right. So these are direct pathogens and not necessarily opportunistic because there's lots of microbes that under the right condition can be a problem, but they're not inherently a problem. And so when I was doing that background research work to understand what the answer may be, the best I could come up with was around zero point zero 0.01 or 0.1% of microbes that are discovered, have been discovered and characterized are actually pathogenic,
Mm.
right? And which then leads you to go, okay, so then 99.9% of microbes that we've discovered are either benign or beneficial. But there's so much work going into that 0.1% that we ignore much of the 99.9%. And that's really where there's a lot of magic in terms of how the microbial world works to influence our health, our wellness, our lives, and so on. And with that in mind, it started that other 99% became very interesting to me. And the other thing you start to realize is that when you diminish that 99%, it really allows that 0.1% to flourish, right? So when you think about like hospital based infections and nosocomial infections, part of the reason why those kind of infections can take hold is because they're very sterile environments. So the other 99% that does a really good job of controlling the 0.1% isn't present at the same level. That tends to happen in the gut, right? Which is kind of where this hygiene hypothesis issue comes from. And so, right around that time, there was a lot of kicking off by the NIH on the human microbiome a project, and studies were starting to come out. And so to me, that's where the answers lie for to really understand the 99% and then how they affect our life and our bodies. And then, of course, how they affect the 0.1% that we tend to be very focused on. So that's really what kind of got me into the world of the microbiome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let me kind of dive into one question that I think is on the minds of a lot of people, right? I think we've heard a lot about the microbiome and how it's important for our health, but I think a lot of people, including physicians, struggle to figure out how to start to operationalize a lot of this. And so, one thing that gets marketed a lot is the idea of microbiome testing, right? Like, test your
Mhm.
microbiome. And you might be aware of a paper that came out, I think it was a little bit earlier this year, that looked at different microbiome assays. I don't think they named the companies, but they looked at, so-called like leading microbiome tests and found that there was so much variability between them that it kind of called into question, at least according to this paper, the validity of microbiome testing. So I'm curious to get your take on the use of microbiome assessment in clinical practice, and your thoughts on this paper, and any guidance you'd give to physicians as they think about how best to characterize the microbiome.
Yeah, that's such an important paper and question, because I think when you take the world of the microbiome and you put a conventional medicine lens on it, it stands to reason that there should be a way to test it, figure out exactly what's wrong, and then intervene, right? But it's a lot more nuanced when it comes to the microbiome. For one of the things that paper is really highlighting is the complexity that is involved in truly understanding the ecosystem. And the complexity is in twofold. It's number one, the currently available technology, and number two, how do you interpret the data? Right, and data interpretation in itself can give you a huge variability in the outcome that you're looking at. So I've developed a microbiome test myself when I was at Microbiome Labs, and we have one of the things that we were very clear about when we were languaging around the test is that it is not a diagnostic tool. And the reason we were so clear about it being non-diagnostic is because of this variability that you can get based on the technology you're using. Where it can be useful is if you're doing certain fundamental things that we know to be good for the microbiome universally, virtually universally, and you're still not moving the needle on that patient completely, then those tests can give you deeper insights into what else you may try, right? Because there may be some things that are screaming out loud on that test that also connect well to the symptoms and the issues that your patients are having. Just to give you a couple examples of that, if you did a microbiome test as a intake part of the patient assessment, it may take you in 50 different directions based on how you interpret the data, and it may take you down the wrong direction, right? Number one, some tests very much focus on pathogens. So it looks like everybody's infected with these amazing pathogens, and everybody has, for example, H. pylori infection, which is detrimental to them. But that's likely not the case. The prevalence rate of true clinically relevant H. pylori infection is not that high in the Western population. But some of these tests basically show you that 80% of people are infected with H. pylori in a clinically significant way. So then now you might be going antibiotics and PPIs and all of those things when those things aren't necessarily going to be useful for that patient. But let's say you do some of the foundational things, right? So we're talking about diet modulation that tends to be universally beneficial for the microbiome. So increasing the diversity of the patient's diet, incrementally adding in and improving their intake of fiber and the diversity of fiber, so soluble, insoluble, resistant starches, and so on, increasing their intake of polyphenols, providing their microbiome some relief from digesting food. So adding in low levels of intermittent fasting, right? So we're talking about a 12-hour fasting period from dinner till breakfast time, and stress modulation, exercise, activity. Those all impact impact the microbiome in a very positive way and tend to be universally beneficial. Let's say you're doing all of those things and the patient is still feeling certain symptoms that you just cannot shake or you cannot move the needle on. You do a whole genome sequencing. So this is a metagenomic microbiome test, and that's a really important distinction. It should be something that looks at whole genome sequencing. You get a pattern recognition, and what you may see on there, for example, is this patient has high levels of sulfate reducing bacteria. Then you go, well, that okay, makes sense because I'm telling them to eat all these healthy things, right? So I'm telling them to eat all these vegetables and lean meats and eggs and all these things, but those all are things, healthy foods that contain high amounts of sulfate, which means that the microbiome of this patient is converting that dietary sulfate into hydrogen sulfide, and that hydrogen sulfide is causing a lot of inflammation in the large bowel, which means absorption rate is compromised. They get a lot of diarrhea, they get a lot of cramping, couple hours after eating, and so on. So they may be eating healthy, but still not getting the benefits of eating healthy, and they're still feeling symptoms. So that right there could give you a clue and go, okay, temporarily we need to reduce the high sulfate foods, right? We need to upregulate protein intake a little bit more until we start to see a shift and then bring back the high sulfate foods. So that's the kind of like ecological clue you can get to drive on patients who are not seeing significant improvement once you do the foundations, right? And that's the big clinical picture part that's missing, is that we often skip the foundations for what helps a healthy microbiome and go right into trying to intervene in all these different things.
Yeah. Is there, you mentioned that some of these tests will show like you know, they will overemphasize certain pathogens that are not actually clinically relevant. Do you have a comment on things that maybe we miss though in the microbiome? Like someone's coming into our office, or even, they're going into their GI doctor. What's the most missed pathogen or reason for people to have GI symptoms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think understanding the pathobiome. So, because rarely is it a single pathogen that causes a lot of problems in people, right? One that we were seeing a lot more as we did tens of thousands of tests that came through and we started looking through the data. One that seemed to be increasing in prevalence in the microbiomes of the Western US population was Bilophila wadsworthia. And Bilophila wadsworthia is a very interesting organism. It obviously, the term Bilophila means that it loves bile, and so it does well when there's a high amount of bile, because a bile is inherently an antimicrobial, therefore it suppresses the growth of other microbes while allowing Bilophilia to increase in its number. Now that comes with a diet that tends to be high in fat, right? And so people are moving towards ketogenic diets. People are consuming high fat foods, fried foods, all of these things that require a higher excretion of bile that supports the growth of Bilophila. Now, Bilophila has kind of a double face, right? Because there are some benefits of having Bilophila, but then when it's excessive, it can dramatically increase inflammation in the body. There's some ties to cardiovascular risk. There are some ties to colonic inflammation. And then the other aspects of microbes are oral-based microbes, oral pathogens that tend to be found prevalent in people with certain GI issues. So, we're talking about like enterococcus, for example, high levels of enterococcus. Where we may not be looking at those enough to look at health risks from people having poor oral hygiene. And then combine poor oral hygiene with low levels of hydrochloric acid production allows those oral pathogens to survive through the gastric acid curtain, and then end up in the small bowel and then large bowel in a viable state. So there's a number of oral pathogens that I think we have to start paying attention to as well. But I think the concept of pathobionts is a really interesting concept, and most stool tests aren't really looking at the category of pathobionts. So what are pathobionts? So pathobionts are all of the organisms in your gut that have pathogenic potential, right? They don't have to be direct pathogens. And in fact, many of them are much more opportunistic. And so they don't express virulence factors and toxins and all that unless the condition is correct. But understanding the relative abundance of pathobionts in that individual's microbiome is a really important factor. That actually showed up to be one of the most important factors in COVID, and why it created such significant illness in some people and not in others who are within the same age cohort, right? So, for example, you could take an individual like a 45-year-old individual who was diabetic, and then a 45-year-old individual that was non-diabetic, and one had 10 times higher risk of hospitalization and death from COVID versus the other. What is the big difference between those two individuals? It is the diabetic individual more often than not had a much higher pathobiome prevalence. A lot of this work was done by University College Cork and their microbiome department there, which is one of the largest microbiome research institutes in the world. And they got so good to the point, one of the presentations that I had the privilege of them giving me, they got so good at modeling pathobionts and the vulnerability it creates in the body, they could look at someone's microbiome pattern and they could tell you whether that individual, when they got infected by COVID, either got hospitalized or potentially died from the infection, and or if they developed long COVID, right? Without knowing any other demographic information about them, without knowing their age, their sex, their health conditions, just by looking at their microbiome and the prevalence of pathobionts. So pathobionts create vulnerability in individuals that makes them much more susceptible to significant impact from, things like viruses and all that, and at the same time from bad food choices, from lack of sleep, from stress, any negative input.
Mhm.
Got it. Super interesting. Let me touch on a couple things you brought up there. So you brought up the oral microbiome. And as you might be aware, there's now been a proliferation of microbiome tests that are now covering other parts of the body. So not just the
Mhm.
gut, but they're now oral microbiome tests. Um, as Brian Johnson made us all aware, there's
The
vaginal
vaginal.
microbiome tests.
Mhm.
There are, and if people don't know, you should look at his Twitter feed. And many others, skin microbiome. I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on the state of the science when it comes to testing the microbiome and these other parts of the body? And is there a way to integrate, or has anyone figured out how to integrate microbiome findings across different body systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, we're going to the integration part of it. We have not seen that. That should be coming right around the corner. Companies tend to specialize in a given area. You've got companies specializing in the stool microbiome, in the oral microbiome, like Bristol, for example. They do a good job with that. There's a couple of skin microbiome tests that are really, to me, hasn't met its mark yet on really giving useful information, in part because the way microbiome testing is done, that's important for people to know, is you have to have a really strong database of the microbes that could be present in that region, whether it's the skin, the mouth, the vaginal canal, or whatever, to compare the sequences that you're building to that database, right? To get accurate information. So we simply don't have as accurate and accessible databases around some of these other regions. So some of these tests can be a little bit compromised, but nonetheless, it can be useful just to give you clues into what may be driving, issues that are hard to correct once you do some of the foundations. I think we're right around the corner from AI integration of all of the microbiome data to provide a complete ecological picture of that individual. And I do think that's important because all of these microbiotas influence one another in one way or the other, right? You can easily see how a dysfunctional oral microbiome can then cause a disruption in the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome can then cause a disruption in the skin microbiome, which means it's not a massive leap to go, bleeding gums and early stages of periodontal disease can then lead to SIBO, and then SIBO can lead to an increased risk of eczema, right? So now your periodontal disease is indirectly causing your eczema, right? And you would never connect those two things. And so I think we're coming up on a really interesting time just over the next like 2 or 3 years that connects a lot of these dots for us.
Since you've now worked with the gut microbiome and the skin microbiome carefully, I'm curious to know if you've seen any associations, because if you look at historically other whole health systems, not our allopathic system, and I think this gets missed a lot in dermatology, other whole health systems will connect anything that's happening externally on the skin, look at the gut first. And that's like one of Dr. Andrew Weil's, like tenets of how he thinks through medicine. So have you noticed any, clinically relevant associations that you can talk about or make people aware about?
Yeah, in fact, it goes both ways. Which is super interesting to me. So we know, for example, and we could take acne, which is so prevalent, right? And you just look at, is there an impact of the gut on acne? And the answer is absolutely, right? And let's look at a couple lines of evidence. Line of evidence number one is, if the gut has any impact on acne at all, then there should be dietary intake impact on acne, right? So what you eat should affect your acne. There are about 52 published studies on diet and acne, and what they show is that two categories of foods in a number of people really drive the formation of acne lesions, inflammatory lesions, and that's dairy and gluten, right? And why would that be? Why would dairy and gluten drive lesions on the face? Well, because in a large prevalence of individuals in our population, both dairy and gluten drive inflammation in the gut, and they drive transient leaky gut. That transient leaky gut increases systemic inflammation, in particular IL-6, TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, and it also increases endotoxemia, which is the presence of LPS, lipopolysaccharide, in circulation. And so then you go, okay, are there studies that show an increase in IL-6, TNF alpha, and LPS? Are those meaningful in acne? And sure enough, there are studies that have compared cohorts that have history or family history of susceptibility to acne, and then they look at their blood levels of inflammatory lesions, systemic inflammatory lesions, and mediators, not lesions, systemic inflammatory mediators, and LPS levels, and they find that when inflammation is low and LPS is low, they don't get lesions. When LPS increases and inflammation increases, they get acne lesions. And then there are studies that have gone even further, showing that this endotoxemia, which comes from the gut, does increase the amount of sebum that is produced by the sebaceous glands, right? And so that then increases the rate of clogging of the pores and increases inflammation in the sebaceous glands itself. And we know that acne is an inflammatory condition. So there's a lot of work that has been done that directly connects a very common skin condition, which is an inflammatory skin condition, to what's happening in the gut. In fact, I have a US patent, a granted US patent, on utilizing a probiotic to reduce acne lesion counts by over 75%. And the way we do it is by reducing LPS using a probiotic and increasing acetate production, which is one of the short chain fatty acids that are made in the large bowel. What we were able to show is that when you have an increase in acetate production, especially from organisms like Ruminococcus in the gut, that acetate leaves the gut, goes distal to the gut, and then ends up in areas like the skin. And the acetate can control inflammation and sebum production in the skin, right? So that's a direct connection. Now, we can go the other way around as well. Dysfunctions on the skin can actually cause disease risk inside the body as well. So there's a very large scale study that is still ongoing. It was initiated over 65 years ago, called the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. There's been hundreds of papers that have come out of this study. Basically, it's one of the only longitudinal studies of aging where they took individuals in their late teens and early 20s over 65 years ago, and they basically followed them until they die, right? And every couple years, those individuals come in, they get a full workup, full check. They're monitoring their diet, lifestyle choices, everything, and they're looking at all biomarkers, signs of aging, pathologies, all kinds of things. So it's very comprehensive. Lots of papers have come out of it. In fact, this is a study that has really shown us that aging is a disease, right? It's not a chronological issue, it's an inflammatory issue, and it's a disease process. And one of the clear things they've shown is that changes on the skin microbiome and thereby the barrier function of the skin leads to a significant increase in disease states within the body itself. So they can tie, for example, risk factors on the skin, so age, skin barrier dysfunction, to things like increased risk of osteoporosis, of dementia, of heart disease, and so on. A great example of that is in psoriasis, right? So when you look at psoriasis, there's a combination of a microbial factor on the skin and an immune dysfunction. It is an autoimmune like condition. And so you've got Staph aureus and low diversity on the skin that are associated with psoriasis. Then you see the psoriatic proteins that are found in the lesions on the skin. You find those same proteins in the bones. And those proteins in bones are increasing inflammation in bones and then increasing osteoclastic activity. As a result of that, making that individual more susceptible to osteoporosis, right? So there's a direct tie there. We also know, for example, atopic, it's called the atopic march. Kids with eczema or dermatitis have eightfold higher risk of developing allergies and food sensitivities because the skin barrier is compromised and antigens are entering into their body through the skin. And when the immune system encounters antigen in the periphery, you can't build oral tolerance against them. You're going to get a hypersensitivity response, which means they have a much higher risk of having systemic hypersensitivity responses to food-borne and environmental antigens. So there's evidence that goes both ways. Skin microbiome affects the body and the gut. Gut microbiome affects the skin as well.
Yeah, I suspect in the future, we look for these subtle differences in people's trends through their blood work, but as the microbiome across the body tests become more sophisticated, we'll probably be able to kind of proactively pick up the beginnings of disease processes through those tests too.
For sure.
I mean, so much you just said there that was just amazing. I do want to take us. Well, let me just ask one question that kind of popped into mind, and then there's a bunch of questions that are coming in about probiotics, so I want to make sure we go there.
Number one question.
Yeah, I want to go to this concept of leaky gut, which I think at this point has become, I'm not sure if it became a marketing phenomenon first or a scientific phenomenon, maybe both at the same time, hopefully scientific first. But, whenever I mean, it makes sense intuitively, to a lot of us, right? Where there's this idea that you get inflammation in the gut that, causes the barrier to become more permeable, endotoxin flows in, inflammation, systemic disease. It all makes sense. But I wonder, based on, whenever I see something that seems so intuitive, I always ask myself, is there something that we're oversimplifying? Is there something we're missing? Yeah. And in particular, in the way it's being marketed right now, I'm curious, is there anything that you think we're missing or oversimplifying when it comes to the phenomenon of leaky gut? And especially more generally, when it comes to healing the microbiome, are there things that you think we're missing when it comes to the popular discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, right? Because I think more often than not, in this area of medicine, so if we think about the integrative, holistic approach to medicine, we do end up missing nuance, right? Because then, like anything else, people want to have hard, fast rules because it's easier for the brain to function that way, right? So, if you had leaky gut, I had leaky gut, it may impact us differently because of genetic factors, because of our lifestyle, because of other family history and risk, right? So, for example, in one individual, the biggest impact of endotoxemia could be atherosclerosis. It could really exacerbate plaque formation in these individuals versus somebody else with lower family history and genetic risk for atherosclerosis. It may not have that impact at all, right? And so I think that picture of individualistic understanding of the impact of endotoxemia is still missing a bit, right? So we don't necessarily, nor should we make it kind of the be all end all umbrella issue that causes everything. We should be looking at it as a significant factor in certain individuals for certain conditions. But and that's missing, right? So it is missing that we look at it at all as a risk factor, right? Because I when I talk to clinicians about it, I kind of find clinicians in two different camps. One camp is like, there's no such thing as leaky gut, right? Still, like that, it just doesn't exist. And then the other one is, it is the thing that's driving all the issues in all of my patients, right? And I think there's a nuance in between those two views that we really have to grab into, because how leaky gut affects different people it can be quite individualistic. I think that's one of the things. And then when it comes to gut health and how you alleviate leaky gut, I think we also more often than not overcomplicate it, right? There's a very interventional kind of mindset into it, like, okay, I'm gonna fix this tight junction, and then I'm gonna go after this one pathogen, and then I'm gonna do this and do that, when we skip a lot of the basics. And a lot of the basics is that there are certain categories of microbes that actually manage and maintain the barrier system in the gut, right? So when we think about the core structural elements of the barrier system of the gut, number one, the mucus layer, right? And what tends to be depleted about it when you look at individuals with intestinal hyperpermeability or endotoxemia, the glycocalyx part of the mucus system, the structural and the thickness level of the mucus system. And then you go down further to the tight junctions and the expression of the tight junction proteins. Then you go further to that. What is the immune system doing in that mucus layer, or the mucosa in general? Is the immune system attacking everything that's coming through, or is it building tolerance? All of those factors are highly relevant to the presence of categories of microbes in that area. And so we're not necessarily looking at how do we enhance the categories of microbes whose role it is to ensure that we have a thick mucus layer, that we have a proper glycocalyx in the, at least in the small bowel, that we are expressing tight junction proteins adequately, and that we're modulating immune response by increasing the function of T regulatory cells, right? So we're missing that part. Those are foundational parts, rather than going in and trying to intervene with peptides and this, that, and the other, right? So going back to basics and the foundations, I think, is a missing area that is not addressed enough.
Okay, Kiran, you have some people that are dying. I knew this was going to be an important topic, is probiotics, right?
Yeah.
So just give us the skinny on probiotics. Like, how are people picking them? There's so many, right? There's people
Yep.
that come in on the seeds probiotics, AG1. We have a preference for the microbiome, the megaspore probiotics. But how should a clinicians think about it? What would you like patients to know about it? How do we know that we're actually repopulating people with what they need? What does it mean when you see CFUs, advertised? A lot of
Yep.
the GI docs like to use the Align probiotic. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think to start with, any probiotic that's used by a consumer or clinician should have clinical trials on the finished form of that probiotic, right? Because that is really important in understanding what it's actually going to do in the gut. Probiotics aren't like nutrient compounds. They're not like vitamins, where vitamin C is vitamin C. You mix it with vitamin D, A, and E, and it's going to function how vitamin C normally functions. When it comes to bacteria, they're much more dynamic, right? They have thousands of genes. They can express them, and they can make lots of proteins and all that. So when you take bacteria A by itself and put it in the body, and then you mix bacteria A with bacteria B, it can change how both of them function in the body. And that's the part that people miss a lot, because where the industry went is like, kitchen sink formula. Let's just throw 19 different strains in here and get hundreds of billions of CFUs, and that's got to be better, right? Well, no, not necessarily, because there's evidence that when you take a couple different microbes and put them together, they can knock out each other's effects. And so this assumption that we're just going to throw individually researched strains together and 1 plus 1 is going to be 2, that assumption is too big of a leap for someone like me. I want to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2 in clinical trials when you combine them, right? So my first direction to anyone thinking about a probiotic is that please ensure that the product you're taking has clinical studies on the finished form, not just on each individual strain by themselves. Because I guarantee you, when you mix it, it changes how that functions in the body. Number two, if you're taking a daily use probiotic, something that for general gut health and improvement of the gut health, there has to be some evidence that that probiotic can move the microbiome itself in one or more positive ways, right? Because if you think about it, even if you're getting a probiotic with 100 billion CFUs, which sounds like a lot, right? You're putting it into a sea of 20, 30 trillion organisms, right? It's literally a drop in an ocean. And so unless those microbes that you're putting in as a probiotic have a way of influencing a shift in the microbiome, you're not really going to be making any significant change in the health of the overall microbiome. Now, can a few billion bacteria impact 20, 30 trillion? Absolutely. And it depends on the microbes. This is why with Megaspore, we went to the spore based bacteria because they have that capability, right? Using quorum sensing and and other functionalities, they can move the needle on the entire microbiome, which can be very, very powerful. So first recommendation, if it's a multi-strain probiotic, make sure that there's clinical research on the combination of the product, because if not, then you have no idea how they behave when you combine them. Number two, that if it's a general daily probiotic for overall gut and microbiome health, like you want it to be foundational for your patient or your consumer, and you want to have general good gut health, you want that probiotic to have some evidence that it moves the needle on the microbiome itself. Then the third category of probiotics, which I think is going to become really interesting and people should start utilizing them more, are probiotics that are very specific for specific conditions, right? So psychobiotics, for example, right? So Bifidobacterium longum 1714 has 8 or 9 published studies as a psychobiotic showing its ability to move the needle on cortisol management, on stress, mood response, and so on. That's not necessarily a general probiotic. That's one you would take if you're dealing with anxiety and stress, and can be very powerful for those individuals. The Align probiotic that you talk about is Bifidobacterium longum 35624. That strain has around 60 or 70 published studies on its impact on the enteric nervous system and the gut brain axis as well, which is why it works so well for IBS, because IBS is a gut brain issue, right? But it's not necessarily a general probiotic that moves the needle on the microbiome. It's quite specific to the gut brain axis and IBS like symptoms. So that third category is you want to look for research strains that move the needle on specific pathologies that you're concerned about, and then utilize those to really move the needle on those pathologies. But you also want to be careful and make sure that someone hasn't taken a Bifidobacterium 1714, which is a great psychobiotic, and mixed it with a bunch of other stuff. Because I could tell you from research we did that if you mix it with any other strains, it knocks out its effect, right? So if it's a heavily researched strain that does a thing really well, you want to take it by itself. The fourth category that is starting to become really interesting are postbiotics. These are microbes that are dead, and even when they're dead, they have significant functionality. Most of those are also going to be for very specific pathways in the system. A great example of that that's been studied to no end is Acidophilus DDS1. DDS1 can work when it's dead. It can work when it's alive, and it has very specific function with the immune system. And it's really a unique strain. So I would be very wary of any company that is simply marketing their probiotic as having X number of species and X CFU count, right? Because that really doesn't matter. So if the main claim of a probiotic is we have 50 billion CFUs and 15 strains, then you know that that was the whole focus in how they formulated the product, and there's not much more that went into putting that together, and there's clearly likely no research on it either.
So I'm sure. So that was super helpful, a very helpful framework to think through probiotics. I'm curious because I know this is going to be on the mind of a lot of our viewers. Are there particular products, right, that you think embody some of these principles, right? And I think people are always looking for, what would you take or what would you recommend? And I know it's going to, all the usual caveats apply, right? It
Yeah.
depends on the patient, depends on the individual, depends on the problem, so on and so forth. But with all that being said, are there particular products that you think are worth considering that kind of fit these principles? And if there are any particular conditions in which they're useful, what might those be?
Yeah, so just take the gut brain one. So Align, fantastic for any sort of gut brain issue, especially the gut brain issue that you're experiencing more in the gut than the brain. So IBS and everything around IBS. So irritable bowel and food intolerances and irregular digestion. Align works well. The thing about Align though, I think, is that you can up the dose quite a bit. The conventional dose in the average product, average SKU within a line is 1 or 2 billion. From the research I've seen, and I've worked with that strain specifically because we were then able to get that strain into Microbiome Labs because we ended up being owned by the same owner of the technology. So I got a chance to work with that strain a lot. And I was taking upwards of 4 or 5 billion CFUs of that strain, and there is a dose dependency improvement in effect. So you can certainly go higher on it. So that's one. And then the psychobiotic, the Bifidobacterium longum 1714, which is found in products like Microbiome Labs, Zen Biome, or Just Thrive, Just Calm, it's called. And what's great about it, it's not mixed with any other probiotic bacteria, because when you mix that strain with anything, it knocks out its effect. That is absolutely fantastic and effective for managing stress and mood. And we know increased stress and increased mood and anxiety and all that impacts the gut very negatively, right? So it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So that strain can be very useful for individuals. I love Saccharomyces boulardii. So if you look at Florastore, especially, we're going to be taking things like an antibiotic, and you want to protect the microbiome, or you've had recent courses of antibiotics. Saccharomyces boulardii is really effective. Florastore has, I think, 300 studies on it. So it's a fantastic probiotic. It's a fungal probiotic, but it's a fantastic one. Restore Flora is a version that has the same type of Saccharomyces boulardii, but then with Bacillus endospores in it as well. A really great general probiotic, and maybe I'm biased, but we've published 18 papers on it, is the Megaspore biotic, and the retail version, Just Thrive probiotic, is fantastic. And the reason why I really like the spore-based probiotic is because it really does move the needle on your microbiome itself. We've published studies showing that in 3 weeks we can shift the diversity in the microbiome very measurably, 15 to 20%, which is a massive shift in a sea of 20 to 30 trillion organisms. We can increase the growth of the keystone species. These are these organisms that hold up and balance the rest of the microbiome. And then we also have 2 studies on endotoxemia. So we saw 75% reduction in LPS concentrations in circulation of people with confirmed endotoxemia using the Megaspore and the Just Thrive. So that becomes really an awesome general probiotic. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah,
Dipti's
and
been
this is
smart
not
enough to use it
this
for a
is not
while.
a sales pitch at all, but just based on data and just clinical relevance and our outcomes and our patients. I'm here at Precision Medical Care in Chicago. We have a predilection to giving this out to our patients, but this is what it looks like in case anyone's wondering.
Yeah, it really moves the needle, and we've done studies on it on things like rheumatoid arthritis, right? So
Mhm.
we did a really great study on it. We did a fantastic study. So, and then the Serene Skin, which is now sold under the Civ Biome Balance. That was based on Megaspore with some enhancements to enhance skin. That's the one I talked about for acne. So if you're concerned about skin issues, that product will definitely improve the skin. So those are the general ones, and then there's numerous postbiotic bacteria that can be really useful as well. Nowadays, when you have, people have access to Chat GPT and Claude and all that, I would ask these AI systems to find you specific probiotic strains or postbiotic strains that have published human studies behind them that affect issue X. Let's say you're dealing with a specific condition, you're dealing with bloating, or you're dealing with issues around bowel movements. You can look up strains that have specific studies on it, or better yet, talk to your clinicians like Dipti. We've got so many clinicians now that are focusing on a holistic picture, and they're doing the vetting for you, which is a great way of kind of taking the guesswork out of it. Because if a clinician's using it and they've continued to use it, they're doing it because they're seeing results, right? And that is a great, I think, for me, mark of confidence of why you'd use a probiotic.
Yeah.
Well, you can feel free to decline to answer this question, but this I think goes part and parcel with the probiotics that you think, or the strains that you think are worth considering. I think you did a good job setting up the framework and giving us some examples. But are there any particular brands or maybe just strains that you think where the marketing has got ahead of the science, right? And you can say, I don't want to answer, but I think it's important for us to also get perspective on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I look at brands that have strong Silicon Valley money behind it, for example, right? And these are more often than not multi-strain brands. I'd rather not say the brand name, but if you look at brands out there that have all this celebrity backing, lots and lots of social media presence, but they're not really referencing any studies that have been done on the finished product. Those are the ones that you really want to be cautious of, because at best it's not going to do anything. But my concern as a microbiologist is I'm always thinking about the capabilities of microbes. And when you throw in 15 different strains and you have 20, 30 billion CFUs, that's a measurable amount of microbes that you're putting into the system. And if you haven't studied what happens when you add all those together and put it into somebody, then it becomes a little bit unpredictable what the outcomes may be. And so I become really cautious about that, right? And there are certainly commercial products out there that have fantastic marketing, look beautiful, are very well funded, and have virtually no research behind them at all, right? And so that's the thing that people should be concerned about. And it's more often than not a multi-strain consortium like formulation. It's more often than not a 10, 15, 20 strain formulation. The thing is, rarely do you need to have 15, 20 strains combined to give you an effect, right? We just talked about single strains that can really move the needle, that have really strong studies behind them. And I think we need to get a little bit more precise when it comes down to probiotics. No more should it be, let's throw the kitchen sink at it and you just put all the microbes in there and they're going to automatically do good stuff. We want to get a lot more specific and a lot more specific about our understanding of how microbes impact your health, and then show the proof of that.
Yeah, that goes for a lot of things in our industry that are marketed heavily. They're not often the best, but they're the things that are in people's ears the most, ears and eyes.
Yeah, and one more thing I would say about probiotic strains, there's also been this tendency, and you see this in like the protein world, right? Where we're just going to throw a probiotic bacteria in virtually everything, and it's like this kind of a product, it may be a greens product, it may be a protein product, a fiber product, like everything, and then they just throw one or two probiotic strains in there, and now it's a probiotic version of that product, right? Be wary of those as well, because they haven't done any studies on throwing whichever strain they pick to throw in there, that there is any probiotic effect by tossing it into that matrix and tossing it into that combination of macronutrients and so on. The thing about probiotics is they can be very powerful. They can be very powerful tools to move the needle for patients on certain things, but just having bacteria in random things that you're eating or drinking and all that all day isn't necessarily getting you the power and the impact of probiotics, right? So be very specific when you're thinking about probiotics, because they can be powerful tools if you pick the right one. If not, you're kind of wasting your money.
Yeah. Then you might as well just try to eat pro or prebiotic rich foods and just do it.
Exactly. Yeah. And we should always be doing that, right? So the other thing I say, as somebody that has built businesses around probiotics, one of the things I've always said is that probiotics play a very important role, but you also cannot forget the importance of feeding the existing microbiome with polyphenols, with fiber, with prebiotics and all that. Like that part can actually move the needle even more than some probiotics. And in fact, generally will move the needle for people in a very impactful way. So we cannot forget that, nor can we probiotic supplement our way out of not eating well to feed the microbiome.
Absolutely.
Let me get your quick take on one last question related to that, and then
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up because we're almost at the hour here. But one other thing that has become popular in terms of supporting a healthy microbiome, in addition to those other things you mentioned, right, like prebiotic fiber, polyphenols, is the concept of fermented foods. And
Mhm.
I think Andrew Huberman and even RFK have talked about really going heavy on fermented foods. And I think in a recent podcast, Huberman talked about I think he's personally trying to almost max those. He's like trying to get as many fermented food servings as possible. It seems like he's on a diet of only that. I don't know. I could be misrepresenting, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. I will say personally, I've found that people have very variable responses to
Mhm.
fermented foods. There are
Yeah.
some people for whom it actually can be counterproductive, and
Yep.
others for whom it's great. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fermented foods that generally have the most studies behind them are kefir, sauerkraut, fermented sauerkraut, and fermented kimchi, and then the fourth one is natto. Natto, which is the fermented soybeans, which you find Japan has really pioneered that, but China has versions of natto and all that. Those are the four categories that I find have the most research behind them in terms of their ability to move the needle on health in certain types of people. But you're absolutely right in that fermented foods can be a big benefit to lots of people, but in some it can be a negative. And part of the reason may be histamine tolerance, right? So when you're fermenting a food, basically what you're doing is taking a known amount of substrates. The microbes are pre-digesting it and then producing new compounds that wasn't previously present in the food. Now, many of those compounds, like the organic acids and the peptides and all that, can have a lot of benefit. But for some individuals, some of the things that they produce, like histamines in the fermented foods, can have a negative and inflammatory response. So my recommendation to people generally with fermented foods is that it's a good goal for virtually everybody to have some amount of fermented food somewhere in their diet, right? Meaning it could be a simple kefir that either you're making or you found a good source of it that's not the stuff you find in the grocery store, right? That stuff. So most commercial fermented foods, just to give people an idea, most commercial fermented foods don't reach the full fermentation threshold or timeline that's needed to see the benefit, right? Because that makes the product too expensive. If you have to ferment something for 45 days to get the full fermentation effect, commercially that becomes very expensive for companies to do that because the product cycles are much faster than that. So then they shorten the fermentation and they do it in 20 days, for example, right? And then they add flavorings and things like that to make it seem more fermented and more palatable, and then they bottle it and put it on the shelf. So a fermented kefir is not going to be the same. Commercially fermented kefir is not going to be the same as what you would do yourself at home, or what you might get from a local farmer's market or people, at your more locally. So I would look at adding maybe one serving of something fermented into your diet each day. I love kimchi. That's an easy one for me because I need spice in everything anyway. And so it's like sriracha or kimchi or a combination of the two adds accent to everything. And I'm getting some degree of fermentation of fermented foods. Um, but you also want to be cautious about it. You want to test it first and see how it agrees with your system because it's not going to be universally beneficial. Now, what if someone said to me, "Can I have a healthy gut without ever doing fermented foods?" The answer to that is absolutely yes. If you're getting enough fiber, polyphenols, the right probiotics, your diet is diverse, you're managing stress, your lifestyle is generally healthy, you're sleeping enough and all that, you can absolutely have a perfectly resilient, healthy gut without ever adding fermented foods. So if for some reason you've tried various fermented foods and they simply don't agree with you, don't stress that you're missing a key pillar of a healthy gut. It can be an enhancement, but it's not necessary for everyone.
You said something very interesting with the fermented foods that move the needle because they're actually all from different regions of the world.
Mhm.
They're endemic to different regions. But I think there's this theory, and I don't know if it's been studied well, that people from different parts of the world, they might actually respond better to the foods that they're ancestrally used to. And so I'm curious if that universally holds, right? Because different parts of the world, like everyone has their own fermented food that they were used to growing up with, if they choose to eat it or not. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So yes, there are absolutely significant regional differences in how your
Mhm.
gut manages different types of fermented foods and foods in general. I mean, if you look at the diets of certain hunter gatherers, for example, or diets that are or microbiomes and diets that are well mapped in different geographic regions, there's a mass difference in the types of microbes that are prevalent, the way those microbes utilize those substrates and those macronutrients. Like people always go back to like the one of the lines of evidence that advocates of like the carnivore diet or ketogenic diet, they always talk about the Inuit Indians and their diet massive, that is massively prevalent in seal blubber, for example. But the studies show that those people have very different genetics and microbiomes that utilize fat in a different way than we would in the Western world, right? I can guarantee you, if any one of us plucked ourselves and put us in those regions and started eating seal blubber every day, we'd be super sick in a relatively short amount of time. And also, the coconut oil is another great example of that. I've used this example in other areas. There are studies that show the type of fat that creates the most endotoxemia, the highest amount of LPS leaking through, is coconut oil, right? And coconut oil, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very high in saturated fat. For a lot of people, it can be inflammatory because of its very unique lipid concentration that's unlike any other food in the world, and also high concentrations of lipid in per gram increases the amount of LPS that migrates through because LPS is a fatty acid product. And so those lipid rafts and chylomicrons that grab fat out of the diet, pull them in, those end up pulling in more LPS. And for a lot of Western people, high amounts of coconut oil may actually be a negative because genetically their ancestors and them have never really consumed coconuts, right? It's much more of an equatorial food. And so in South Asia, we're eating coconuts and putting coconuts and bathing in coconut oil all the time. And so our microbiomes are much more used to it and manage it better.
Right.
So yes, you're absolutely right in that. And if somebody, for example, in the middle of America, all of a sudden started doing a lot of natto tomorrow, which is a Japanese fermented soybean, they probably have a lot of GI issues in
Right.
the beginning. You know, so people need to kind of go slower into this. There is absolutely a regional difference. That's actually called beta diversity when we measure microbiome testing. It is the distribution, the prevalence of different species in your gut microbiome that is regionally directed.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so
Okay.
much for that. I think you probably blew the minds of some of the seed oil people with that insight. But thank you so much for your insight and time, Kiran. This has been so great. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour.
A whole day. Yeah.
Yeah, probably a whole day. But we'd love to do this again
Yes.
sometime very soon. I know our audience has really appreciated all of the insight you've brought. But yeah, thank you so much once again. Look forward to doing this again soon. And yeah, to everyone who tuned in, thank you for doing so. And we'll see you all in the next one.